we've been meeting that way for about 2.5 years now. Good to be with you.
Awesome. Keith.
Hey everyone, my name is Keith Gunner. I am the pastor at New Creation Church right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. We originally started in our house as a church plant there and have since grown to a warehouse, but have continued because out of our roots and our DNA as this house church model. And so we continue to meet in homes while still doing corporate worship together right outside of Nashville.
Great. Naomi.
Hi, I'm Naomi Kelly from Old Forge, New York. It's in the Adirondack Park. And I have a group, we call it Weaving Home, and we meet in people's houses and online. And we've been doing this for several years. We worship also outside sometimes. So yeah, it's fun.
Aaron and Ayana.
Hey everybody, I'm Aaron and
Ayana.
We are in Pittsburgh and we are pastors of All Saints Community of Faith, and we are in different settings as well. All Saints is intentional home community, and we are an interracial community, and we try to practice the Lord's Supper around the table with each other.
Thank you. Elmer.
Hola, sí, soy Elmer. Estoy trabajando con el Ministerio Hispano-Latino.
Hi, I'm Elmer. I'm working with the Hispanic Latino Community Ministry
De la Iglesia Presbyteriana en Louisville, Kentucky.
of the Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Kentucky.
Y Elena y yo trabajamos juntos en esto también.
And Ellen and I work together in that also.
Tenemos como 8 años de estarnos reuniendo en las casas.
We've been meeting in houses for about 8 years.
Y ese es el corazón, el reunirnos en casa.
And that's the heart of it all, is meeting in houses. And I want to add that Elmer and I
go look everywhere, try finding it.
Elmer, maybe we could, yeah, let's all mute. Elmer and I work together with the ministry, and I'll be interpreting for Elmer. We're married. Just so you know, if you see me talking while we're muted, it's because I'm interpreting to him into Spanish what you all are sharing.
Thank you, Elmer and Ellen. David.
I am David Gambrell from the national offices of the Presbyterian Church USA here in Louisville, Kentucky, where I work in the Office of Theology and Worship.
Great. And our 1001 staff members who have also been leading churches in people's homes over the expanse of their ministry. Michael, you're muted.
Yep. Hi, I'm Michael Gerling. I'm the 1001 Associate for the Northeast. I'm based in Pittsburgh, and previously I was co-pastoring a new worshiping community called The Upper Room, which started in my co-pastor's living room. And Chris is also on this call and is probably better equipped than I am even to answer questions, because he was the one who actually had to face with the implications of having church in his own house.
We'll welcome Chris to hop in whenever he feels ready. Sean Kang.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Kang. I am the Central and Western Associate for 1001 and have here in Houston, and I planted a church, was there for 13 years, but we started from our house and in our apartment clubhouse and largely kind of a house church-based model, and currently at a new church here, starting off part-time, pastoring a congregation.
Great. Sean Chow.
Good morning. My name is Sean Chow. I am the 1001 staff for training and leadership cohorts, and I led a new worshiping community that was a series of house churches 4 years ago in New Jersey.
Great. And Gad.
Yeah, Gad Mpoyo, associate for the Southeast region, and I also lead a church called Shalom, basically for immigrant and refugee, and we also started as a house church. Like we started in my house, and then we were moving in every member's house. And so that's
Great, Gad. Did I miss anybody that's on our panel? As you all can see, that we bring a lot of wisdom from the 1001 movement, folks who have been leading worship in this way for some time. And we are looking forward to sharing what we learn with you. We have thoughts for those of us who are ready to gather, eager to see our communities again and have them in one place, but also for those of us who are a little more risk averse and want to be cautious as we share together common worship. So we'll talk a little bit about what steps we can take to build in-person community while still respecting the social distances that we are encouraged to keep. I will put up a slide in a few minutes that includes all of the bio information for our main presenters. And you can also find our staff on our Facebook, on our 1001 website. I'll remind everybody to go ahead and mute yourself. That will help us keep quiet so we can all hear our presenters and not hear each other's dogs and doorbells. The first part of our conversation today is really going to be about experimentation and how we might put groups together geographically by interest, risk tolerance. And Taylor Morgan from Tacoma, Washington is going to lead us off here. Taylor?
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about experimentation. I have watched, especially my established church pastor friends, do such a phenomenal job at helping to create great stability for their communities in this beginning time of COVID, right? And that has been just so important. And so I feel like we're all experimenting, right? This has been a great leveling ground for everyone because we are all forced into trying new things and being in new ways together. And so I hope right now that especially for my established church friends, that as they have been able to, and as you have been able to kind of create this stability and gather your people online, that now we have this opportunity to maybe experiment a little more deeply as we're able to gather in small groups. And so I love that word experiment. And I think it's just a great paradigm for how to think about these next few months together. I realize that everybody's kind of phasing program for your state is a little different. So I'm going to talk about this as a Washingtonian, and that might be a little bit different for you. But we are going to be at some point moving into phase 2 and being able to gather with people outside of our household in groups of 5 or less. So that will be our next kind of step. So I wonder, as I think about my own community, how we can help to create opportunities for people to worship, even in that situation, even in those circumstances, right? We don't have to wait until phase 3 where we can gather in groups of 50 and get all 50 people together. We can start by putting our one household and maybe 1 or 2 others, depending on size, together to worship as a unit. And I think there are some really creative ways that we can encourage people to do that. Now, of course, we're talking about the benefits of house church, and so we can invite people to do that in their homes, right? But maybe when we think about house church less as a location and more as a style, right? We can also invite people to gather in lots of other creative places. For us at Gather, I know we're talking about how do we equip people and to experiment with gathering in public places when they're open and available. So our parks have started to open, some of our hiking trails and stuff like that have started to open. People can social distance easily in those places and stay 6 feet apart, right? When our restaurants reopen, they're gonna open to accommodate 50% of their capacity. What does it look like to equip and empower people to gather in those groups of households plus 5 and go support a small business, right? Go eat at a local restaurant together and have your worship time together there as well, right? So there are lots of creative ways that we can invite people to start to think about experimenting with that. For us, we're a small community. We have a lot of kids. And so we'll probably start thinking about, okay, how do we go ahead and make it possible for our folks to go support a local restaurant like that, while maybe inviting the kids to hold space together at one household and making sure that that household has a babysitter present. Because you know what every parent needs right now is a date night, okay? We need a date night. So that is, looking at this as creative ways to kind of meet several needs, but also create opportunity to love and serve the community. And I think that we can also do that by thinking about what groups naturally gather in our communities as well. Many people have experimented with small groups, right? Has anybody not experimented with small groups? I think most of us have. There are still more people who have experimented with missional communities in the established church. Has anybody here, you can show me with your hand, have you experimented with missional communities in your context yet? Some, a little bit. I see head nods, that's close enough. So I think that when we think about this, one of the things that's important to consider is what really is the difference between a house church and, say, a small group, right? Like, that's a question that we want to ask, because what I would hope is that in this time, even starting at this first stage of gathering with just a household and 5 other people, that we could go beyond just saying, study a life guide together and call it a night, and move into equipping people to be the church in that small little community, right? So I know, Nikki, are we able to do a little discussion as I ask this question? Is that possible?
Let's try.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, and I'm not going to linger long, so I'd appreciate it if you jump in with an answer and don't worry about having that awkward Zoom interruption. Okay, someone will stop talking if you talk at the same time. But I wonder, what do you think the difference is between a house church and a small group? Off the top of your head. Anyone?
Don't forget, you need to unmute yourself.
Yep, you got to unmute.
I'll start. I think about the practice of the sacraments as part of house church that might not be part of a small group.
Yes, that's great. And you know what? That sacramental experience in the context of an actual dinner together is one of these beautiful ways that we can invite people to experiment during this time. And what I love about having people meet in for some kind of meal, even if it's a picnic in a park where they're sitting 6 feet apart, is that it feels so much less so much less pressure to invite them to do that. So we can give our friends a liturgy that helps them to do a very basic sharing of the sacraments together, right? And they can do that on their own in that group together. And so that's one way that we continue to experiment as well. That's a great one, Michael. Anything else? I think also, and you can interrupt me, just unmute yourself and raise your hand. I'll see you if you have something that you want to add to it. I think another part is also that generally in our house churches or missional communities, or however you want to call your community, one of the things that defines us is that we also are reaching into our spheres of influence, our neighborhood, and places that need to be loved and served. We're serving together, right? We're on mission together. We're doing things that are intentional in bringing people into mission together. And so helping those groups, even at that beginning stage, start to think about how can they make an impact as a group as a household and 5 others, right? And helping them to connect with the places in their community where they can do a mini food drive, or they can do something that creates mission together. So for me, at least, and we'll hear from others, I think that those differences are that we're practicing the sacraments, right? One of the ways we talk about this at Gather is that we're having communion, community, and commission together. So we're highly relational, we're having communion together regularly, and we're on mission together regularly. Another thing that we can do creatively in this time is to think about how people might want to gather. So we will have a Zoom gathering like we do right now. In our Zoom gathering, we have multiple teachers. We teach dialogically. So I don't give a 25-minute sermon, but what we'll likely do is we'll ask people who would like to gather for dinner in those two households and then join our Zoom meeting together. So now instead of everybody being entirely separate in households, they'll be able to come together and participate. And instead of being constantly kicked out of Zoom breakout rooms, we can have them just mute themselves and talk at their table as a little group, which will be a great boon to us. So we also will think about how we can equip people with resources to practice discipleship. I think that's one of the other things that really defines house church or missional community for me, is that we are so passionate about making disciples who make disciples. And so in this time, I think this is something for the established church too, that can be such a great benefit in this time, because we have the opportunity to take a household plus just a few more people and equip them with ways to practice discipleship. So at Gather, some of the things that we do are we ask people to call each other and to ask each other, what is God doing in me, around me, through me, and what's the invitation from the what is the Holy Spirit inviting me to? That's a very basic discipleship tool. As we introduce people to doing that with each other, with people that they trust and know, then we can also equip them to keep using that tool as they meet and engage in relationship with Jesus-seeking people. Right? So to use these opportunities to say, get together once a week for dinner. We're going to give you a gift certificate to a restaurant. We're going to pay for a babysitter to show up at your house. And we want you to sit around the table and ask each other these 4 questions. It doesn't have to take all night. You can play a game at the end of it, whatever you want. But we're asking you to do this. And you know what? That is worship. That is time together. We're going to ask you to participate in the Lord's Supper, to answer these 4 questions, and to enjoy each other's company. And we believe that that is going to be a worshipful experience. And so these are some of the ways that we're thinking creatively about how we can gather people together. And I will put my email in the box if you'd like more information on, especially how you might think of creative discipleship in that time as well. To think about spurring people on to learn how to disciple and to be discipled by each other.
Taylor, I love those ideas. And I wonder if there's anything some of our other panelists want to add about experimentation in your communities. Any of you want to add something? I don't. Aaron, Ayana, are y'all jumping in?
Yeah, and I just kind of, some of the things that Taylor said are on our hearts at All Saints as well. We think that there's a lot of different creative ways to meet. One of the things that we have tried to do is send some liturgies to the people in their homes so that they can do some of that work in their own household. And then there is some sense of community building in that, as the community shares and those kinds of things. And so even in their own households, we're finding like they are able to keep up that community.
Some of these liturgies, Aaron, that you have shared are available in the document that we're going to post on our website, and it's already on Facebook in the live stream now. But some of the liturgies you created for people to use at home in this time are available for all of our participants today. Anybody else on our panel want to jump in about experimentation?
I know a piece of wisdom I received about doing experimentation with house churches, or just with church in general, is the importance of naming it as an experiment to everybody who's going to participate. Because you're going to have some people who don't want to try the new thing for any number of reasons. And to be able to say to them, we're just trying this once. If it doesn't go well, or if you don't like it, don't worry, it probably won't happen again then. And if it turns out you do like it and it does go well, then great, we'll keep doing it. But to help people see that if it's especially something that's awkward or that they don't enjoy or it's not going well, for them to just have the assurance that it's a one-time thing then, or just something that they're trying.
Good word, thank you. Taylor, final thought on that?
Yeah, no, I think that that's such an important point. Yeah, to be able to put a time limit on it and let people know, and also to let them know that actually you're going to put a time limit on it, and then you might try something else, whether they're liking it or not. You also might ask them to experiment a step further because we're all continuing to move through this very different process, right? So things are just constantly changing from this point forward. Yeah, I think that's there's so much wisdom in that. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, we know that if we're going to experiment with things, one of the things that we as leaders want to try to do is to prepare those who are going to lead alongside us. We're breaking up into smaller communities and people's homes. How we equip the folks who will be leading these multiple small gatherings is really important. Elmer has been leading house church communities for 8 years, did you say, Elmer? So he may have the longest running experience of any of us. And I want him to share with you all what he's been learning over time. Elmer and Ellen, you want to take it now?
Sí, nosotros en esta experiencia del COVID-19, estamos más, nuestra ansiedad está en cómo volver a las casas, que esa es nuestra forma de ser ministerio, iglesia.
In this time of COVID-19, we are really kind of anxious and eager to return to the houses. That's what we're anxious for. And that's how we desire to be able to be together as a community.
Yo sé que eso no es la ansiedad que tienen las iglesias que son establecidas. La ansiedad es volver al edificio.
And I know that's not the eagerness or the anxiety of folks who may be part of a more established church. Maybe their eagerness or their anxiety is to go back to the church building.
Y esto de estar ansiosos por volver a las casas, que es la normal forma en que nosotros nos hemos trabajado estos 8 años.
And so our eagerness to go back to the houses, which is how we've been worshiping the last 8 years.
Es volver a estar con la familia.
It's about going back and being with that family that's hosting or with the different families.
Que es la célula principal de la iglesia.
Which is the principal cell of the church.
Y cuando nosotros iniciamos este ministerio, pensábamos que íbamos a estar nuestra meta era estar en 6 meses en un edificio.
And when we began with this ministry about 8 years ago, our primary objective was to be in a church building within about 6 months.
Y en 6 meses pensábamos rentar un edificio y reunirnos cada 8 días en ese lugar.
And we thought that in 6 months we'd have a building to rent, we'd be meeting there regularly.
Y nos dimos cuenta en esos 6 meses que no necesitábamos edificio.
But then we realized within those first 6 months that we didn't need a building.
Es mucho más barato para la comunidad de fe hacerlo en las casas.
A lot less expensive for the community of faith to worship in houses.
Nosotros tenemos ahora 3 círculos.
Right now we have 3 circles of houses.
5 casas que nos reunimos el viernes, 5 el sábado y 5 el domingo.
5 on Friday, among which we rotate and worship, 5 on Saturday and 5 on Sunday.
Y eso lo que hace es que nosotros estamos moviéndonos cada 8 días a una casa nueva en cada círculo.
So in each of those groups, we're moving to a different house every week in each of the Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night groups.
Y en cada 5 semanas volvemos a la misma casa otra vez.
And every 5 weeks, we're back in that house we were in 5 weeks before.
Unas 50 casas están de alguna manera conectadas a eso.
And about 50 households altogether are connected in one way or another to the whole of those 15, you could say, base houses.
En este momento de esta crisis, nosotros estamos tratando de mantener conectadas al menos esas 15 casas.
So we're at least just trying to keep at the very least connected with those 15 houses that host worship.
Y como una cosa central de nosotros como comunidad de fe, de la iglesia, es vivir el amor inmerecido hacia los demás. Eso es lo que estamos tratando de ponerle todo el empeño.
And what we're trying to really do above all else is to live out that I'm trying to think of the word in English. Inmerecido sería like amor inmerecido. The love that you don't earn, that you can't earn, and extend that to everybody else.
Especialmente a los vulnerables,
Especially to the most vulnerable,
los que no pueden dar nada de regreso.
the ones who can't give anything back.
En ese sentido, en este momento, la comunidad con la que trabajamos es gente que no tiene acceso a beneficios del gobierno.
And the
La mayor
people,
parte.
the majority that we're working with are people who don't have any access to government benefits, unemployment, stimulus checks, things like that. ¿Y cómo se
Y
prepara?
Entonces, en ese sentido, nosotros tratamos de ver de cómo acercarnos a ellos sin necesidad. Si ahorita no se puede poner el cuerpo, no podemos ir por ellos a estar con ellos en las
So
casas.
right now we can't be with them in their houses. So we're trying to figure out how to be present.
Yo estoy haciendo algunas visitas a patios
Sometimes I'm visiting people in their
o al
yards
porche de la
or on
casa
the porch at a distance
con máscara.
with a mask.
Hago llamadas telefónicas,
I make phone calls.
mensajes de texto, uso mucho los mensajes de
I
texto
do a lot of text messages with
para
people,
convocar las reuniones.
including to call people to participate in the meetings on Zoom.
Estoy haciendo videollamadas de familias conmigo.
So I'm doing Zoom calls, I'm using video with the families that host the worship
Estoy
usually.
usando Messenger,
I use
WhatsApp,
Facebook Messenger,
Zoom, depende de
WhatsApp,
lo que ellos tienen.
whatever they use.
Estoy enviando postales también
And
con algunos devocionales para que ellos lean.
I'm sending letters to people with the devotional guide that we share among the community.
Y en aras de tratar de responder a las necesidades, porque ahorita el problema es de dinero para estos
And
hermanos.
also trying to respond to people's needs, because right now it's really about money for survival.
Estamos tratando de juntarnos con otros organismos locales
We're trying as a community to connect with other local organizations or agencies
para tratar de simular el estímulo, el cheque de estímulo que el gobierno da
to
a través de
simulate
donaciones de la comunidad para esta gente.
by receiving donations in the community to simulate the idea of stimulus checks for people so that they can survive.
Porque celebrar el culto
Just because celebrating worship
llena el espíritu.
fills the spirit.
Pero el pan
But
del
bread,
estómago
the bread for your stomach
tiende a frustrar a la gente aún para celebrar la fe.
can frustrate people and keep them even from celebrating their faith.
Entonces estamos tratando de ver de qué forma nos acercamos de la forma más integral posible a estas familias.
We're trying as best as we can in the most holistic way we can to be present with these families.
Esto para mí es como una tormenta
So
de
for
nieve.
me, this is like a blizzard.
Mientras la tormenta está, te quedas en casa
As long as the blizzard is happening, you stay at home.
y resuelves como puedes.
And you figure out how you can resolve things.
Y una vez que pase, puedes volver a lo que puede hacerse normal.
And then once the blizzard passes, you go back to doing things as you used to.
Después de esta experiencia, yo estoy seguro,
After this experience, I am sure
la comunidad de fe, la iglesia,
the
el cuerpo de
church, the
Cristo,
community of faith, the body of Christ
tendrá nuevas herramientas para caminar.
will have new tools
No solo cuando las cosas están bien,
to walk forward, and
sino
not
cuando
just
las cosas están
when things
difíciles.
are good, but also when things are bad.
Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, comentario.
So if anybody has questions or comments.
Muchas gracias, Elmer. Does anyone have a question? There was a little comment in thread in the chat about the word that, Ellen, you might have been struggling to find an English equivalent for unconditional love, grace. You're muted, Ellen and Elmer. Is that what you were saying?
God's grace.
God's grace. Amen.
I think they were asking for the word in Spanish. What was the word that meant the love that you
Inmerecido, it means undeserved. That's what I was looking for, the word undeserved.
Yes. Other questions from our listeners, particularly for Elmer? So much practical wisdom from doing this for so many years with such a large network of communities. I think it is. Elmer, do you attend on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday evenings?
Sí, yo soy ahora el líder que coordina cada reunión en cada día. Y es fácil
Right
porque,
now, I am the leader who coordinates the meetings on each of those days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but it's easy
porque yo puedo preparar la reflexión del
because
viernes
the
para los
reflection
3 grupos.
for Friday can be used with the group on Saturday and also with the group on Sunday.
Y cada reflexión yo aprendo, aunque use el mismo texto, yo aprendo cosas nuevas.
And even though I'm using the same scripture, I learn new things each time. And I would just add, this is me talking, when we are in people's homes, because we're in somebody's home, they are hosting. So they're providing, if there's a snack or a meal afterward, they set up the chairs,
Es barato.
so it's inexpensive.
Es la gente poniendo,
Mhm.
y ellos dicen, no, pastor, no
Mhm.
pongan nada ustedes.
So it's the
Yo lo voy a
people
poner.
who make it happen. And sometimes Elmer's explaining that they will say to him, don't worry about it. We'll have, a food or a meal prepared. But at the very beginning, it was usually the ministry that was paying for a pizza or bringing cookies or ice cream bars. And that still happens on occasion. So this is me speaking. But more often than not, the host is preparing, buying the pizza or preparing tamales or getting sodas and cookies or whatever. That's going to be the snack afterwards, the fellowship meal.
Y muchas veces las mejores experiencias las tenemos cuando tenemos la conversación mientras comemos.
And many times the best experience we have is after after worship. It's when we're gathered and we're eating together. That's the best experience.
Yes. Keith Gunter has some additional practical experience like this with coordinating the efforts and sharing the burden and responsibility. Keith, why don't you talk a little bit about your community's experience and how that has shifted over time? I think also there's some questions in the chat about congregations that have house church circles alongside a conventional congregation. And Keith, I think that New Creations has kind of grown to that too. So why don't you jump in now, Keith?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief, but also give you a lot of information, and I'll include my email. So if folks need more details or questions. Little background, we started in our house, and so it seems like it was a house church. And as that grew, we went to a more corporate worship. But in the meantime, for each season, fall, summer, winter, and spring, we would do new house groups. Most of our house groups ran for 8 weeks. They provided childcare, whether at the home or at a drop-off location at the church, and came with a meal. And so all those things worked wonderful before this pandemic. And they were great settings because people didn't mind gathering, and whether it was a bunch of kids or a few kids, and the meal was something everyone was comfortable with. And those are beautiful ways for the community to gather. I think it's been mentioned earlier, though, there's a level of comfort now, both going into someone's home, the larger crowd, even more than 10, also including, wow, the food preparations and people nervous about how did they prepare it? Where did they get it? Should I bring my own food? So those things we're having to readdress for our community and what works. Fortunately, I love the lead in today. Experimentation is going to be key throughout it for any of your contexts, as it will be for ours. We're lucky that we have some previous experience with different types of house groups. We've not only done it from groups somewhere between 10 to 12 adults plus children, but we've also done for a season that I didn't think was going to work, but folks loved. And we simply called them a very creative name, super small groups. So you can coin that one. It's really creative. But basically, it was groups of no more than 4. And we said, this will be a group that's really intentional. And a lot of people said, well, no one's going to talk. I said, well, there's only 4 people. Someone has to talk. And that has been wonderful because we often try to allow groups to exist for 8 weeks and then disband them to avoid cliques. Other people keep them together forever. That's intimidating for our group. But what we discovered in these groups, because of the closeness of these groups, they now call themselves rogue groups because they continue to meet even when I told them to stop, which is a beautiful thing. I'll appreciate that and honor for what the passion and the love they have for each other. Some of the things we do that work for us is back to the experimentation. We do a limited season. We say this is going to last for 8 weeks. And if it, like Michael said earlier, if it works, we're going to keep it going. If it doesn't work, we've already set an end date. And so that's a beautiful step for us. The other thing is we really try to find a facilitator. I often call them the lead question asker. So that takes away someone thinking they have to be the theologian in residence and the key biblical scholar that day. They can literally be the person who says, I have more questions. And that's less intimidating, and folks can kind of step in to lead that conversation. Some of our groups have used books. We've provided and written our own materials. We've used some resources out there just in Christian bookstores. Sometimes we've done sermons. So they've watched the sermon, and nowadays they'll watch the sermon and then they'll get together and meet and let that be our discussion guide. So you can provide it for them, or use published items as well. We recognize this season your whole church probably is not going to jump in and do it. Our whole church is not ready, even though that's how we were formed. So we're allowing folks to enter in when they are ready and when the comfort level is there for their family, and learn along the way. We also designate a lot of different roles within the group. For example, we have one person who we call the timekeeper. And the timekeeper is simply someone says, listen, we're going to start the group at 6 and we're going to end the group at 7. Otherwise, people get exhausted because if a group's going well, it can go longer and longer, especially if it's someone's home and they're thinking they want to get their kids to bed or whatever it may be. So we honor the time and say, hey, we're starting here. We're going to gather for the first 30 minutes. And for the last hour, we're going to enter into that discussion. So we are intentional. Often when we didn't have a timekeeper or someone with a lead question asker, it was a great group that talked about Netflix the entire night. And while there are wonderful times for that, and we have trivia nights and we want those things to happen, if it is a house church and you're trying to create a setting for worship, someone does need to be the worship leader. That phrase is intimidating for a lot of my non-church friends to call them a worship leader. So it's the lead question asker for our group and our community. I think someone mentioned in one of the questions it's made me smile because it sounds like my church. There are difficult people. There are frustrating people, and there are ones who you'll have to just, they're like the kidney stone. You just kind of have to hold on to them because yet they're part of the body of Christ, and you just push through them. But at the front end, I think the more communication you can do for your groups and what you're trying to do, from we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to try doing this. So just to honor, this is the expectation. There's a funny video you could even show. I should have sent it to you earlier, but you can Google it. It's called Shallow, SHALLOW, small groups. And it really makes fun of the crazy things that could happen in a small group. The person who can talk the entire time and you're just trying to get them to be quiet. While you want them to share, you also want them to invite others to share their experiences. All the way down to the person who refuses to share. So it just honor that there are different roles, honor they're going to be unique in the room, and let them play out. And you'll be shocked, I think, by the compassion of one another. We have folks who are meeting now who are saying, wow, I never knew during this season how compassionate people can become, because they are kind of weary and tired and a little bit overwhelmed. And at least it puts us all kind of in the same playing field. And then I'm trying to look at some of my notes just to add. These are just kind of a practical steps. The more you can say, here's what we're aiming for in this group, here's where we're going to end in this group, and here's where we're going to start. And then these people can help lead us. What that does for me as the pastor is it allows me to meet with the lead facilitators. So we have multiple groups. I can't always be in every single group, and you want that group to relax when the pastor's not in the room. And so a lot of times I'll just meet with the leaders. How's it going? How can I help you? What support do you need? Do you need more ideas of question? Let's talk about the scripture and give them as much information as they feel comfortable needing. And trust the Holy Spirit. And I know that's new for Presbyterians, but it's a wonderful tool to sit back and just let the conversation go where the Spirit leads it. And then you may have to bring it back in once in a while. And often one group had an entire session really excited about it, but it led into talking about a family's adoption. And they began to share their story in a beautiful, vulnerable way. And the group leaders said, you know what, I'm going to step back. And they called me afterwards, first in a panic and yet in tears. They're like, I'm so sorry. They shared their story, what God was doing in their life, but we never got to this. And I was like, wonderful. Be at peace, let God work, say amen, and let's move on to the next group. So just trust the Spirit to guide you. And I'm trying to go through questions. What questions do you have about some of the practical things we've done? We've continued corporate worship. We've allowed this to be an add-on, knowing that not everyone in our church is ready for this yet. Anything you want to ask, Nikki, or that's being asked while I've talked?
I do want to lift up the realization that there are many homes that are not very accessible for folks who have ability issues. And so Bethany lifted up the possibility of having a space in the church building that is accessible, where one group gathers, so that folks who have different abilities are not excluded, when many of our homes are just not set up to accommodate folks with different abilities. And I think that's important thing for us to think about. And the other thread that's running over there is thinking about how this might be a safer way for especially older, most vulnerable adults can gather in small groups of people who are similarly isolated, not out in the larger population collecting germs and viruses, so that they can have community together. We're running low on time because there's so much good content, and you were really transitioning to what I think Aaron is really good at talking about, and that is how the role of the pastor shifts when we are equipping leaders in small group gatherings and house churches. So I want to give Aaron, Ayana, and then Naomi a few minutes to talk about what they've learned. And then we'll come back and grab the questions. Stephanie's wondering about children in house churches. I know Keith and Taylor, you both have some thoughts on that. So get those together and we'll come back to that after we talk about the role of pastor. Aaron.
Hey, y'all. As we have done our ministry in All Saints, it has been an unfolding ministry. And both Ayana and I have served in different settings as well. At the same time of doing All Saints. And so there's been a lot of kind of personal growth about what it means to be a pastor of a house church. At All Saints, what I've learned for myself is that the typical role that I have traditionally had as a pastor is very, very different. And so I find myself being much more oriented towards, Keith, I think you mentioned this word, but being a facilitator, and to be a person that is trying to create a creative environment, an experimental environment that people can come and that will provoke them to have conversations that are healing conversations and provoke interaction among each other. So I think the two things that have happened for me in my role at All Saints is that I stir the pot a little bit, if you want to put it like that, to promote creativity within the group, but then also I take care of the conversation. And so we are, as we sit down and share a meal, Ayana and I, we care for who is speaking and who is reflecting and so on. And so we spend a whole lot less time doing formal teaching, preaching, or administration in All Saints. And in some ways that has felt like a loss to me, because it's always fun to preach. But at the same time, we have found some creative ways to give the work back to the people. We come up with liturgies that we can share in our gatherings, but in this time, I don't think All Saints is ready to gather back at a house yet, but we are coming up with creative liturgies that we pass out. We drop them off at the members' homes, that they can do it within their own household. And in that sense, there's some kind of shared community. One of the other things that is an idea that is percolating right now, hasn't been done for All Saints, is a progressive dinner as we are quarantined in our houses. So one family makes a dish, they drop it off to the other family, that family makes a dish, drops it off to another family, and so on. And then we share a meal via Zoom that we have prepared for each other. And so I think that's like on the horizon, but that's kind of our role, to create things that provoke community and create things that help the people of All Saints take up the spiritual work in their own households. And then
yeah, I agree with everything Aaron said. As I think about, and as he said, we have served in traditional context. I've been an administrative pastor actually for much of my ministry. And so one of the things that I see is very different about my role as a pastor at All Saints is that in practice, it requires just a different level of intimacy with my folks. It really is just so much that you lose that kind of assumed authority that you can have when you're in a pulpit from afar, and you have to be available and willing for the immediacy of people's pushback to what you're saying, to be able to bear one another's burdens in the moment of people sharing. As Aaron said, one of the things we do as an intentional multi-ethnic community is we are trying to facilitate conversations of healing and grace, as we try to be not only an anti-racist, but a loving and healing community presence in the world, right? And so there are difficult conversations that we are having, and you have to be willing to deal right in the moment with that. You have to be willing to have almost like a broad tent of witness that you're willing to have theologically. What I mean by that is that people have a lot of different ideas about what the Word of God means, and there's no real buffer. There's no kind of life group packet that you have that kind of lists questions out. So you're really in the moment with people's real and raw emotions. Also, as a house church pastor, you're modeling. I find that we are modeling a welcoming of people into our home, because most of the time we do meet at our home. So we're modeling an intimacy and a vulnerability every time we are gathering together as a community. And we are inviting people to love one another, yes, but we are trying to point to that is the kind of vulnerability that Jesus is inviting us into. Just a different kind of transparency, a different kind of intimacy. I would say a different kind of boundaries. It's not no boundaries, right? We're still clergy, ethics, even somebody mentioned in the chat about kind of liabilities. There are still liabilities and boundaries, but it's a different kind of boundary. It's a different kind of boundary on your family, on your marriage, on your making sense of the gospel in real time. And so I find that to be just totally different than what it means to have kind of a more established traditional. I was joking with Aaron, in our house church, there's no secretary that fields your phone calls and tells you, and so you're just our folks call, and they call each other and they call us, and it's not that we are ever available, but it's that we're present in a way, and in a more immediate way. And so I find that to be very different, especially from the administrative pastorate that I've had. Yeah.
And just to kind of follow up on that immediacy, much of the ideas that we put forward, their response are like, yeah, maybe we can do it like this instead. And that's both beautiful and frustrating, but that is the nature of like All Saints, is that the people really are shaping our time together.
Yeah, and that's important to mention as people, kind of on this chat are thinking about how do we live into that model in a new way, or for the first time. You really do give up some power. and I don't want to belabor that. And I know we can kind of talk about that in a lot of different ways, but you really are part of the equipping process. Part of is that priesthood of all believers is really like modeling that and being willing to lay down some of your own, everything we learned in seminary, right? Laying down some of that sense of, I do have a sense of what the right answer is here, and I do have a sense of the direction that I want us to go, and really working with people for them to find their own theological voice. And so it's hard, it's humbling, but it's beautiful. I mean, it really is beautiful to see people take up that work, in our context at least. And you do wonder, if we were just seeing them once a week for an hour on a Sunday in a different context, I wonder, how and how different they would take up that work. Yeah.
There is so much wisdom being shared here. I'm hopeful that maybe some of us will have some time to stay around for the conversation, but I do want to get Naomi and David in. Naomi's got a different experience, and David is one of our resource gurus. So I'm going to stop y'all for just a second and invite folks, if you're able to stay past one, and some of our panelists are able to stay, I'll be here and let us continue with some of our questions. But Naomi, any other words of wisdom you want to share?
We've been meeting for a few years, and I just want to share how empowered the small group has become. They're just taking leadership roles. It's really amazing. One example is I always put a candle on the table, and we usually meet at my house. And then one day, one of the people came in with a basket, and she had made this beautiful spider web, because we're called Weaving Home. And she created it out of string, and we were all connected. And so her artistry came into the space and created amazing worship. And I also think this is a wonderful way to encourage people, the small groups, because they're so intimate and people just can thrive and grow. Another piece, though, is that people need to be accountable. So we have to keep that in mind, the accountability. So I think that's what I wanted to say, because we're running short of time.
Thank you, Naomi. We may be able to come back to you with some questions, but David Gambrell has shared with us some resources from the Book of Common Worship and has some other thoughts as we create liturgies, and particularly for traditional building-centric, sanctuary-centric congregations who are trying to do this in homes. Having a liturgy that helps center people and gather people is an important resource. So David, why don't you jump in here with some thoughts?
So many things I'd love to talk about. Thank you, Nikki. Unfortunately, I'm somebody who does have to leave at 1. I have an appointment starting right after this. So just very briefly, I'll tell you that I have loved and learned so much from this conversation, and am so grateful to listen in on it. It is shaping the way I'm thinking about my work in the national offices, even as you speak. And it has me thinking about my experiences 25 years ago now in an intentional community when I was a mission volunteer in South Florida. I don't think they called themselves a house church, but there was a new worshiping community that met down the hall from me in the building where I lived. So that was my house church experience 25 years ago. It's great to revisit that with you all today. There are liturgies in the BCW that I think would be helpful for house churches. One that I shared in the document with you is one for dedicating a place for sacred use. This might be something that you could use. Well, it's intended for house churches, coffee houses, churches meeting in any kind of non-sanctuary space. And it's something that you might be able to use as you gather again after our time of separation, as you begin to come together again, whatever that space might be. Perhaps you'll need a new space, a different space that allows for more social distancing or more accessibility. And this would be a way to set that space apart for the worship of God. So I commend that to you. The other thing I want to say is just that our directory for worship tradition, I think, is especially well suited to people holding liturgy loosely. Our directory for worship is kind of like a compass that points us to the primary things. It doesn't spell it all out, but it describes what happens in Reformed worship in broad contours. The directory for worship has been recently revised, and one of the serious considerations in the process of that 2017 revision was we wanted to address congregations that and communities and missional groups that met and prayed and sang and celebrated together in all kinds of spaces. So we hope that when you read that new directory for worship, that revised directory for worship, you will recognize your community there. And we hope that it'll be a good resource for you.
Thank you, David. I'm sorry that you have to pop off so quick. Does anybody have a quick question for David? His email address is david.gambrell@pcusa.org, and he's our staff. Incredible resource. So thank you, David. Again, this document has some Celtic worship services that have been shared by Naomi, some things that the Teeters have prepared at All Saints, this blessing for worship in a space that comes from the Book of Common Worship that David has offered to us. So that's available on Facebook now, on newchurchnewway.org, and will be available on 1001.org website later today when that gets up. Anybody who can stay, I'm glad to help you have some more conversation and questions. If you have to go, I understand. To our panelists, thank you so much. Your wisdom and your generosity with your insight and experience has been a huge gift. I'm grateful to you for sharing it. As people hop off, I'm sure our numbers are going to go down. But if you have a question, I welcome you to just unmute yourself and ask it. If you're here, have a question. Thank you, Sojung, for dropping your name in the chat. And Sojung is another associate for theology in our offices, and she's also a great resource for us. Anyone else have anything you want to ask or share? We still have 40 folks on this call, panelists. So if there's something you missed saying, there's so many people here to hear you.
I would just add, I saw a few, I couldn't see everything as it was scrolling through, but just a few questions about children. And we do have quite a lot of children when our whole group is together. And honestly, I feel like we have been better and not as good about really targeting that training and discipleship toward the children. So we often have times where they have experiments to do, readings to do. We try to include them in as much of the liturgy and especially the sacrament, right? So they are active parts of that. But there are times and there are weeks where there are like loud kids running around in our basement as well, just kind of doing art or whatever. And so I think that it's important to us that we are using this home space. I think we have an incredible opportunity to really be shaping and discipling our kids. And just full disclosure, sometimes we are better than that than other times in terms of equipping them to be those leaders, and equipping them to have, be cultivating their own spiritual life. I can't speak to COVID because we are not meeting in person in these last 2 months. And so I think some folks had some questions about, okay, how are you kind of negotiating that with kids? But we're not negotiating that in this season. But I do think that house churches have an opportunity for kids to be right there at the center of the fellowship and to hear the conversations. It's been really precious too. Some of our teens, we have a few teens in the mix, and to have them over time move from the kiddie table to the grown-up table, and participating in the conversation in that way has been just really, really precious. And I think they're getting more than they bargained for in that.
That was beautiful. I know Elmer chimes into the chat. He typed a lengthy set of thoughts earlier about how they include children. And I want to ask Stephanie Fritz, if you're still here, can you introduce yourself? Stephanie is with the Office of Christian Formation, and she's offered herself and her office as a resource. Stephanie, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks. Hi, Nikki. I'm Stephanie Fritz, Associate Coordinator for Christian Formation, and this has been a great conversation to have. And I think that many of our established church educators, pastors, leaders have been asking how they can better be equipping families for faith formation at home, and how this situation has brought that forward. So I joined today's conversation to hear a little bit more about that, because I think house churches have excellent resources for this.
Yeah, I would add to that that we've found, like for us, we have 15-ish kids, 12 to 15 kids between the ages of 6 months and 15. And especially for our little ones, like we need someone who is going to work with them, because we found early on that especially the moms were just not able to participate. They were being constantly pulled aside to do all sorts of things. So we kind of created a split time where our kids are with us for our dinner time, where we're also doing some spiritual formation elements, and also for communion, because we always tell the communion story. So everybody around the table participates in telling the story to each other, including our kids. And then we move over to a time where the adults have a time where they can kind of focus together, and then the kids are in a different area of our house. And that's been important for us, but we've also wanted to, we have like a Facebook Live Bible study for the kids every day that our children's ministry person does, because we do value that time for the kids, and we wanted them to be able to stay connected. And then we gave our parents some resources where they could craft spiritual formation activities for their kids during COVID. So that's been an important part for us, just to resource parents.
Great thoughts. Elmer, do you want to add anything? Roberta, I see you. I'll grab you in just a sec. Elmer, do you want to say anything? You put such great.
Nosotros estamos teniendo experiencias bien bonitas con los niños. Ellos, nosotros lo que hacemos es que los incluimos en la lectura.
We have really wonderful experiences with the kids when we're meeting together in person. When we've been doing that, we include them in the reading of the scripture.
Tratando de enseñarles a leer español.
Trying to teach them to read Spanish.
Porque ellos saben inglés.
Because a lot of these kids many of these kids are second generation who've been born here and don't know how to read Spanish.
Entonces les enseñamos leyendo la Biblia.
So
cuando leemos las escrituras,
by reading the scriptures.
Ellos van leyendo cada quien.
Everybody in the circle, también. The adults and kids will read one verse each.
Y lo que hemos tratado de hacer es cambiar la mentalidad de que los niños tienen que estar aparte porque molestan a los adultos.
And we've tried to change the model where kids have to be away from us because they're bothering the adults.
Es en las casas las reuniones.
These are worship services in houses.
Por naturaleza es ambiente familiar.
Naturally, it's a family environment.
Y los niños son de la familia.
And kids are part of the family.
Entonces, hay que adaptar la mente.
So sometimes you do have to.
De que vamos a tener bulla.
Adapt your mind that there's going to be noise.
Y tratar los adultos de concentrarnos.
And the adults try to get the adults at least to concentrate, even in spite of.
Y muchas veces si hay muchos niños.
And a lot of times if there are a lot of people.
Yo trato de hacerla acondicionada a los niños.
Sorry, if there are a lot of kids, I'll try to change the reflection, just really direct it just at the kids.
Lo que los niños entienden, los adultos lo entienden.
What the kids understand, the adults are going to understand
Pero lo que entienden los adultos, de repente los niños no lo entienden.
What the adults understand, perhaps the kids won't understand.
Entonces tratar de adaptar.
So try to adapt.
Great thoughts. Thank you. Roberta, what's your question?
I actually, in keeping with this conversation and thinking about discipling, I wanted to recommend two excellent resources in terms of how you're thinking about discipling. One's called Spiritual Conversations with Children, just came out this year. And the other is The Spiritual Child by Lisa Miller, who has talks about spiritual formation in the first decade of life and spiritual formation in the second decade of life. And all of that is stuff that, you know, parents and we as adults need coaching on to understand how to be engaging our young people so that we are spiritually forming them, not just in terms of what we as adults want, but also so that we are mindful of the ways we do things as adults can also really connect deeply with kids. So I wanted to lift up those two resources. I'll put them in the chat box.
Thank you so much. Those are excellent resources. Shifting gears a little bit from children, Chris has asked in the chat about communion in house churches. What do we do when there's not a teaching elder present in every location? How do we ensure that we are staying close to our polity? And Chris, you've come to an interesting group for that sort of conversation. Who from our panel wants to address this this topic of the sacraments? Taylor, you're unmuted. Is that on purpose?
No, I have a separate mic that mutes me over here, so I don't have to keep reaching toward my computer. No, please, someone feel free to address that.
I think what we do is we share in the liturgy. So I never read it all myself. We pass it around. And so if it gets to a point where somebody else has the line that you break the bread, they break the bread. So we're all doing it in community. Don't tell the Presbyterian.
I would like to jump in with what Naomi shared and invite you not to tell our presbytery too, but I'm just joking. You know, I think what we believe in this time in particular is that there are some things from our previous way of being church that we have grown accustomed that the church does things for people and that the people are recipients of that. And so the ordained, the teaching elder, the ruling elder, they get to administer the sacrament. But I guess I'm wondering if this is a time in which the church can't do those things for people, and if we have a shift in focus that we can encourage the people to take up the spiritual work themselves, then if that's the mindset, it changes the focus from who's going to administer the sacrament to how do we enable the people to share in the sacrament right now faithfully. Yeah. And so, you know, what we have tried to do, and we're just kind of trying it right now, is to prepare a home communion like packet. We drop off the liturgy, the bread, a little vial of grape juice, and just invite the family to lead their household in communion around the table in their own household. And, you know, I think there's some risk involved in that. But there's also like a really wonderful opportunity for a family to take up that spiritual like work in their own house that a pastor can't do for them truthfully. And so we are just kind of watching that unfold and not sure what all is going to take place with it, but I don't know, it seems exciting to us.
Yeah. There are means for your church, just like with at-home communion to the sick, to have your elders, your session just okay people to essentially serve communion the same way you would do for at-home communion with the sick. So if you're worried about the polity part of it, that can just be okayed by your session.
There are plenty more options for chartered congregations with sessions of elders to do this than there are for many of our new worshiping communities. Elmer has some thoughts here, and I also want to point you all to Eric Samuelson's note in the chat, some wisdom from a Lutheran friend. Elmer, tell us about communion in your communities.
Sí, una vez celebrando la comunión en una casa
One time when we were celebrating communion in somebody's home,
y estaba una hermana de la Iglesia Católica Romana
there was a woman who also participates in the Catholic Church, who's part of our community, who was there.
y cuando repartimos la puse a ella a
And
repartir
when it was time to share the
el pan.
elements, I asked her to take the bread around to people,
Y ella empezó a llorar.
and she began to cry.
Y entonces una amiga de ella me dice, ¿sabe usted por qué está llorando?
And a friend of hers said to me, "You know why she's crying?
Porque ella pensaba que nunca iba a tomar la comunión,
She thought she would never be able to even take communion again
porque por las condiciones en su familia
because of conditions in her family.
no le permitía en la Iglesia Católica Romana
The Roman Catholic Church does
participar.
not allow her to participate in communion in the mass.
Para mí esa experiencia lo que me dice es
So what that experience tells me,
que esos elementos, el bautismo, la Santa Cena,
these elements and sacraments,
son
baptism,
instrumentos de la gracia
communion,
de Dios.
are instruments of God's grace.
Y como dijo el hermano Aarón,
And like Brother Aaron
Es-
said,
el fin principal es dar esa gracia
The
a través de esos
principal-
elementos, esa gracia de Dios,
the principal end
merecida.
is to give that unmerited grace of God to people, to extend that grace to people.
Si tenemos gente capacitada por la iglesia, hay que hacer uso de ella.
If we have people who are trained by the church to do
Pero
it,
si no,
use them.
el centro es dar la gracia de Dios.
But if not, the center of it
Y
all
si
is
la
to
comunión sirve para
extend
eso,
God's grace. And
y
if
si la-
communion allows
y
us
si
to do
el
that,
bautismo sirve para eso,
and if baptism allows us to do
quien
that,
esté usando esos instrumentos no
Who-
es tan importante.
ever uses those tools, that's not the
Es dejar
important thing.
ser que seamos instrumentos
It's-
de esa gracia de Dios inmerecida.
It's letting ourselves be used as tools of that unmerited grace.
Amen, Elmer. For those of you who are not a part of the new worshiping community kind of movement, I think what you need to know about this group of folks, in which I count myself a part, is that so many of the things that have been important polity-wise fade away when you are experimenting and doing research and development. And there is this resolute reliance on the Holy Spirit to fill the gaps in and to carry us to places that we might not have gone otherwise. And we often operate on a, forgiveness, not permission model. And don't tell my boss that. That's just how we have done that, and have been beautifully wowed by the work of the Spirit among us. So much good conversation here. Is there any, Taylor? Yes, you want to hop in?
Yeah, I would say I realize that can be a really big jump for people, right? Like that can feel really uncomfortable and intimidating. But it can also be a really big jump for like our people too, right? And so I think there are really great ways that we can invite people to start stepping into, step by step, this sense that they are as able to recognize and proclaim God's work around them as anybody else that they've experienced, particularly pastors, ordained individuals, right? And so like some ways that we experiment with at Gather that I think can be really helpful are things like every time we gather, we ask a question along the lines of how have you experienced God's presence? This is a question that really just helps people to start to realize that God is working around them all of the time in mundane ways and in amazing ways, but then also to be able to articulate it. So they are in charge of being able to explain and exclaim how God is actively working, right? And then to be able to invite them step by step to start doing things with communion. So for us, I had mentioned we tell the story together. What that looks like is that we literally just ask people to tell one line of the communion story as they know it, right? And so one person will start with, well, Jesus was gathered with his disciples the night before he was betrayed, or the night he was betrayed. And then one person will tell just one other line. And it creates this really low pressure way of inviting people to be able to tell stories, gospel stories organically and claim them for themselves, but then also to have a role of leadership in facilitating that for the group as a whole. Whoever sits nearest the bread breaks it. Whoever sits nearest the cup pours it. And so it becomes something that everybody is participating in small ways, and nobody feels the pressure of having to now administer the sacrament as such, right? And so it becomes accessible for people on many different levels wherever they're at. So I think that can be a really important way of thinking about how to equip our people to do this.
Excellent, Taylor. Thank you so much for that insight. Beautiful stories. Wrapping up, anyone have anything else? I want to share my screen with you and just offer those of you who are still with us, in case you missed, the names of our folks on our panel, if I can make it go. Elmer Zavala, Keith Gunter, Aaron and Ayana Teeter, Taylor Morgan, Naomi Kelly, David Gambrell. These are the folks that you heard from today, and I'm so grateful to each of you for sharing with us. And then our staff members, Sean Chow, Gad and Pollo, Michael Gerling, Sean Kang, all were with us and are available as resources to you. And finally, if you are wanting some more insight and perhaps some coaching for how to implement some of these things in your community, we do have a network of coaches in the 1001 Network, and we don't work just with new worshiping communities. Jeff Eddings is our coaching coordinator. He is somewhere on this call, and his email address is here. If you'd like to work with a coach to try to implement some of what you're learning or think through some of the challenges that you'll experience in your unique context, we're here to help you with that. Or if your church wants to start a new worshiping community out of your existing congregation, we would love to help you think about that even further. Anybody else want a last word? May the peace of the Lord Christ go with you. Thank you so much for being with us today. All of these resources will be available on the web later this afternoon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.